Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Erica Pothig, and I'm the Acting Assistant Secretary for the Office of Policy Development and Research. And I'm very pleased to welcome you to our second quarter update on housing market conditions and other research. As is our usual practice, we will lead off our program with an update on the quarterly market conditions given by Kevin Kane, our Chief Market Analyst in our Office of Economic Affairs, and be followed by a panel on the now sort of very famous Moving to Opportunity experiment. And we're joined by a very distinguished set of panelists, Larry Katz, who's Allison Professor of Economics at Harvard University, Michael Stegman, who's Housing Finance Counselor to the Secretary at the U.S. Department of Treasury, and Susan Clampet-Lundquist, Assistant Professor of Sociology at St. Joseph's University. The panel will be exceptionally well moderated by Todd Richardson, who's the Acting Deputy Assistant Secretary for Policy Development in the Office of Policy Development and Research. So we are joined today by folks who have joined us in person, but I know we are also joined by many who are watching us via webcast. And thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. If you choose, you may tweet your questions using the hashtag PD&R update. We will be taking questions after the panel, and please do submit your questions to us. With that, let me turn it over to Kevin Kane.
Thank you, Erica. As is my custom, before I begin, I want to thank Randall Goodnight, field economist in the Oklahoma City office, who always helps out by putting together the maps that you'll see in my presentation this afternoon. Note about the maps, the color themes of the maps are all the same, where brown indicates worse off conditions or declines in a variable, and blue indicates better conditions or increases. We're introducing some changes this time around with the maps. The national maps will now have a regional focus rather than a state focus, and we've included some regional level maps for certain factors that highlight changes at the metropolitan area or at the state level. Before we begin talking about the housing markets, let's talk about the nation's economy. First, we're going to look at non-farm payroll jobs, which is a measure of the number of jobs in the economy. And the first figure shows the year-over-year percentage change in non-farm payroll since 2002, looking at the 12-month and 3-month averages through March 2012. The 12-month average, which is shown in black, shows an annual change and is a more stable measure of economic performance. The 3-month average, which is shown in red, is a good indicator for where things are heading. During the 12 months ending in March 2012, non-farm payrolls averaged nearly 131.9 million jobs. This was up 1.3% or 1.7 million jobs compared with a year ago. The 3-month average is trending a bit higher, showing a 1.6% year-over-year growth rate. For the fourth consecutive quarter, every region in the country added jobs relative to a year ago, so the entire country's in blue. In the first quarter of 2012, growth was led by the Southwest and the Rocky Mountain regions at 2.2%, shown in the darkest shade of blue. And every other region grew at a rate that was slower than the national average, which was 1.6%, with moderate growth of 1 to 2% shown in the medium blue, and growth of less than 1% shown in the light blue. This next map shows growth in the Southwest region by metropolitan area. Those areas in the darkest shades of blue grew by more than 2%, and that's 21 of the 47 metropolitan areas in that region. And this includes Houston at 3.6%, Austin at 2.9%, and Dallas at 2.4%. The national unemployment rate was 8.6% during the first quarter of 2012. This was down from 9.5% a year ago. Regions in blue had a rate that was lower than the national rate, led by the Great Plains at 6.7%. Those regions in brown had a higher rate than the national average, led by the Pacific at 11%. And on a state level, North Dakota still had the lowest rate in the nation at 3.8%, and Nevada had the highest rate at 12.3%. What about the change in unemployment from a year ago? On a national level, the unemployment rate during the first quarter of 2012 was down nearly 1% from a year ago, and the regions in dark blue declined at a rate that was greater than or equal to the national decline. And you can see that that's much of the country. The largest decline occurred in the Southeast, which was down by 1.3 percentage points, falling from 10.4% a year ago to 9.1%, with the declines led by a 1.8 percentage point decline and a 1.7 percentage point decline in Alabama and Florida, respectively. The rate declined in every region of the country except for the New York, New Jersey region, which was up slightly by 0.2 percentage points. Now let me give an overview of the current housing market conditions. As a result of the continued weak economy, sales market conditions remain soft in much of the country. Just for a bit of background, balanced conditions exist when the quantity of housing supplied equals the quantity demanded. Soft markets occur when the quantity of housing supplied exceeds the quantity demanded, and we have a surplus. And tight markets occur when demand exceeds supply and we have a housing shortage. The Case, Shiller, and CoreLogic home price indices show that home sales prices continued to decline during the first quarter of 2012 relative to the first quarter of 2011, although the rates of decline are slowing. This is the 7th consecutive quarter of declines. Existing home sales declined by 2% in the first quarter of 2012 relative to a year ago, and that's the same rate of decline that we saw in the fourth quarter of 2011. Inventories of new homes for sale were down 20% from a year ago and 21% for existing homes. Based on the current rate of home sales, there's a 5.2 month supply of new homes compared with a 7.3 month supply a year ago, and there's a 6.2 month supply of existing homes compared with an 8.2 month supply a year ago. The sales vacancy rate was 2.2% in the first quarter of 2012. That's down from 2.6% a year ago. Rental market conditions are balanced to tight throughout much of the country, and conditions continue to tighten. An estimated 51% of new apartments completed during the fourth quarter of 2011 were absorbed within the first 3 months. This was down significantly compared to a rate of 64% absorption a year ago. And multifamily production increased significantly in the first quarter of 2012 relative to a year ago. So if both of those trends continue, then the declines that we see in vacancy rates will probably stop, and we may see vacancy rates start to rise in the future. Let's take a look at regional conditions. These are assessments provided by our regional economists throughout the country. Improvements in an area are shaded in blue, and declines are shaded in brown. So as you can see, there's not a whole lot of change going on. No significant changes from the previous quarter. Sales market conditions around the country remain soft, but conditions are improving in most regions. In the Southwest, conditions went from soft to slightly soft. On the rental side, conditions remain relatively unchanged from last quarter. In the Mid-Atlantic, previously balanced to tight conditions are now classified as mixed, with conditions being slightly soft in Baltimore, tight in Philadelphia, and balanced in the District of Columbia. Most areas remain balanced to tight, except for soft markets in Texas, Nevada, and Arizona, but all of those markets are also improving. The CoreLogic and Case-Shiller home price indexes show declines of 1.7 and 1.9% respectively during the first quarter of 2011 to the first quarter of 2012. This is the 7th consecutive quarter of declines for both of those indexes. And if you squint really hard at the screen and you look at the FHFA index shown in red there, you will see that the FHFA index is showing a slight positive gain in prices in the first quarter of 2012, up by about 0.5%. This next map shows the change in the CoreLogic index by region from the first quarter of 2011 to the first quarter of 2012. This is non-seasonally adjusted data and includes distressed sales. Nationally, the decline was 1.7%, and half the regions are in brown, representing price declines, the other half in blue, representing price increases. New England and the Midwest declined at a faster rate than the national average, down 3.5% and 2%. The largest gains occurred in the Rocky Mountain region, which was up by 3.3%. And on a state level, the largest decline occurred in Delaware, which was down by 9%, and the largest increase was in West Virginia, which was up by 4.5%. According to the Census Bureau, the median price of a new home in the first quarter of 2012 was $232,200. This was up 2% from a year ago, and according to the National Association of Realtors, the median price of an existing home was $158,000. This was unchanged from a year ago. This next map shows the price changes in the New England region at the metropolitan level during the first quarter of 2012. 14 of the 18 metropolitan areas in the region declined at a faster rate than the national average, and 6 of those were by 6% or more. The foreclosure situation remained relatively unchanged in the first quarter of 2012. This map shows the percent of home loans that are 90 days or more delinquent, in foreclosure, or in REO as of March 2012. The national average was 7.8% of all loans in those 3 categories. This was down from 8% in March 2011. The 3 regions that are in the 2 shades of brown have a rate that's higher than the national average, while the other 7 regions are below the national average. Most regions remained relatively unchanged, with the exception of the Pacific, which was down 2.2 percentage points from a year ago, and that was led by declines in Arizona, Nevada, and California of 3.2, 3, and 2 percentage points respectively. The highest region in the country was the Southeast at 11.1%, and as you can see from this map, that was primarily because of Florida, which still has the highest rate in the country at 18%, and that rate's relatively unchanged from a year ago. Mississippi and Georgia are also above the national average with rates of 9.5% and 8.3% respectively. Existing home sales decreased by 2% in the first quarter of 2012 on a year-over-year basis. This was the same rate of decline as last quarter. 6 regions had a decline greater than the national average, led by New York, New Jersey, and Great Plains, both at 11%. And the largest increase occurred in New England, which was up by 8%. Just to note, that's not shown on the map, new home sales were up by 13% from the first quarter 2011 to the first quarter of 2012. Looking a little closer at New England, sales were up in 17 of the 18 metropolitan areas shown. And just to note there, in Lewiston, the only area to decline, the decline was only 22 homes, so it's on a relatively small scale there. All 4 of the metropolitan divisions that comprise the Boston CBSA experienced significant gains. Single-family home building, as measured by building permits, increased by 18% in the first quarter of 2012 to 98,000 homes relative to the first quarter of 2011. Single-family home building increased in every region of the country, except for New York, New Jersey, where it remained flat. The gains ranged from 5% in the Mid-Atlantic to 53% in the Rocky Mountains. And the number of multifamily units permitted was up by 77% to 59,900 units during the first quarter of 2012. And the number of multifamily units permitted was up in every region. The increases ranged from 25% in the Mid-Atlantic to 228% in the Northwest. Rental market conditions continue to tighten around the country. According to REIS data, which covers 200 market areas around the country, vacancy rates were down in 179 market areas, and they were up or unchanged in 21 market areas. The average vacancy rate for all areas covered declined by 1.3 percentage points from 6.2% a year ago to 4.9% in the first quarter of 2012. There were 13 market areas with a decline of more than 2 percentage points, those areas shown in dark brown. According to the Census Bureau for the entire U.S., the rental vacancy rate was 8.8% in the first quarter of 2012, down from 9.7% a year ago. Taking a closer look at the Southwest region, vacancy rates were down in 25 areas, and they were up in only 4 areas. The rate was down by 2.2 percentage points in Houston, but that market still remains soft with a vacancy rate of 8.1%. In addition, vacancy rates declined by more than 2% in Fort Worth, Beaumont, and Sherman-Denison, which are all shown in the dark brown. Market rents were up by an average of 2.2% nationally in the markets covered by REIS from the first quarter 2011 to the first quarter of 2012. The average market rent in the first quarter 2012 for the 200 areas was $1,070. That's compared with $1,047 a year ago. Rents increased in 198 of the market areas. So only 2 areas where it didn't increase. It was down 1% in Fort Myers, and rents remained unchanged in Jacksonville. Rents increased by more than 2% in 79 of those market areas, led by increases of 5.1% in San Francisco and 4.2% in San Jose. And once again, highlighting the Southwest, markets increased in every metropolitan area of the Southwest. 14 of those areas had increases of more than 2%, and every area except for Beaumont increased by more than 1%. So in summary, year-over-year job growth for the first quarter of 2012 was 1.6%. Sales markets remained soft in the first quarter of 2012 with continuing price declines and a slight decline in home sales. And rental market conditions remain balanced to tight throughout the nation, with rents continuing to rise and vacancy rates continuing to decline. For additional information, you can go to the first quarter 2012 U.S. Housing Market Conditions Report. You can feel free to contact me or contact your local regional or field economist. At this time, it gives me great pleasure to turn the microphone over to Todd Richardson.
Thank you, Kevin. That was very helpful. In fact, it's one of my favorite things. I always like to get these snapshots, these quarterly snapshots. It's like candy to me. You know, you can see all this stuff about what's going on in the country in a 12 minutes or a 15-minute presentation. It's fantastic. The presentation today, the panel we have today is on moving to opportunity. And before I start, I'd like to make a note that, a couple of notes. One is that the Deputy Secretary is coming in here at 4 p.m., and so, or we have to exit at 4 p.m. on the dot, apparently. So everybody's aware of that. The other thing is that, you know, Erica was up here. She did a nice introduction. But what Erica failed to mention is that she's one of many people, but a very key person in having made moving to opportunity as successful as it's been in terms of a research demonstration. When Erica was at the MacArthur Foundation, that's where I first met her, she was interested in, MacArthur was interested in providing funding to support the moving to opportunity research. And so she was very patient as we tried to figure out how we could make it possible to have funding from outside funders be able to be used to make this a full-fledged demonstration. It was a time of fairly scarce resources for research, and had we not had funding from MacArthur, a number of other foundations and other federal agencies, we wouldn't be here today to talk about these research findings. So I want to acknowledge that Erica played a very large role on MTO before she came here, and now that she's here, she's been here for us to be able to actually release these findings, which are very, very interesting. So with that noted, thank you, Erica. So in 2010, there were 42 million persons in poverty in the United States. 6.3 million of those persons in poverty live in neighborhoods of extreme poverty, or neighborhoods with a poverty rate of greater than 40%. And between 2000 and 2010, we actually saw a significant growth not only in poverty, but we also saw an even larger growth of persons in poverty in these neighborhoods of extreme poverty. So the question then becomes, is living in a high-poverty neighborhood harmful for poor families? So as the researchers who worked in Moving to Opportunity have pointed out, there's studies dating back to the 17th century that show that people living in distressed neighborhoods have greater criminal involvement or fare worse on educational and economic and health outcomes than others living in less distressed areas. And in fact, when I was in policy school, William Julius Wilson's landmark 1987 book, The Truly Disadvantaged, argued that in these distressed neighborhoods, there's a lack of, and I quote here, mainstream role models that help keep alive the perception that education is meaningful, that steady employment is a viable alternative to welfare, and that family stability is the norm, not the exception. But I will note that almost all of the past research was observational. So there remains uncertainty about the degree to which variation across neighborhoods and people's outcomes reflect the independent causal effect of neighborhood environment per se versus the propensity of different types of people to live in different areas. So this brings us to moving to opportunity. There was some research from the Gautreaux program in Chicago that suggested families with vouchers that moved to the suburbs fared better than those that remained in the city of Chicago. In 1992, Alex Polikoff, who had worked on Gautreaux, convinced congressional appropriations and authorizers to create Moving to Opportunity and provide $70 million for housing vouchers. The idea of the program was to provide counseling to families to help them move from public housing into lower poverty neighborhoods. Fortunately, that law also called for an evaluation. When the Clinton team made the decision to take advantage of this program, by providing funding to do a very rigorous experimental evaluation. So it became that MTO was not only a program, but it was a controlled experiment that took advantage of the fact that more families would want these vouchers than there were vouchers available. As such, we were able to randomly select from a pool of applicants who wanted to move from a high-poverty public housing environment to a low-poverty neighborhood with a housing voucher and compare them to the families who applied but were not selected in the lottery. With 4,604 families in the study, this gives us a very robust sample to measure the impact of the simple intervention of helping a family move from a high-poverty environment to a low-poverty environment. Families leased up in New York, Baltimore, Chicago, Los Angeles, and Boston between 1994 and 1998. We conducted an interim evaluation where we saw impacts as of 2001, and this final evaluation where we see impacts as of 2010, 2011. One of the great things about MTO is the interesting research question about the impact of neighborhoods brought together a very diverse group of researchers to study the impact of the program. And in that vein, I asked three folks who have worked on the research in various capacities to speak today on what we've learned and what they think it means. So our panel members today, as Erica pointed out, is Larry Katz from Harvard University. And he served as the principal investigator on MTO. That was the MTO final evaluation that was recently completed. We have Mike Stegman, counselor to Treasury Secretary Geithner currently, but he was from 1993 to 1997 the Assistant Secretary for Policy Development and Research and was one of the key players in creating the Moving to Opportunity demonstration. And we have Susan Clampet-Lundquist, who is an assistant professor of sociology at St. Joseph University, and she has published a number of papers using qualitative research about why the families had the impacts we have seen. And so this sort of brings together the quantitative, the qualitative, and the policy experience with the program. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Larry, who's going to go through the key findings from the final evaluation. Thank you. You got the buttons right, left?
I think so. Well, since Todd did such an excellent job in the introduction of going over basically the background of MTO and the motivation, I think I can go through that quickly. But I first need to say a couple words. The long-run evaluation of Moving to Opportunity was a large team effort. There are only a few names on this slide due to the limitations of the format. I was told I could put slides in for HUD. There would be many other names if you allowed me to have smaller font. But Jens Ludwig has been the project director, and Lisa Sanbanmatsu has been instrumental in every aspect of the project, and we've gotten tremendous both conceptual, intellectual, and logistical help from people at HUD for many years, including Mark Schroeder and Todd, Michael years ago, John Goring at the beginning. So it's been a large team effort involving economists, sociologists, people who do health, physical and mental health measurement, and you will see that we have a wide range of outcomes we looked at beyond just standard education, income, housing, and earnings. Okay, So I'll very quickly go over the motivation for the study and research since Todd went over it already. As he noted, there is a lot of concern for racial and economic segregation across neighborhoods in the U.S. We have still tremendous racial segregation. The typical African-American family lives in a largely African-American neighborhood, particularly low-income ones. The major changes in fair housing, improvements, and economic opportunities for African Americans have meant substantial improvements in many of their neighborhoods, but have actually and led to reductions over the last several decades in racial segregation. But over the same period, economic segregation has increased, so that low-income African Americans, low-income Hispanics, low-income whites are much less likely to live with middle-income or higher-income families than the past, and that, as sort of predicted 25 years ago by William Julius Wilson in talking about the decline of inner-city neighborhoods and the incentives of middle-class families to move out of poor neighborhoods, has actually been larger for poor minority families, particularly African-American families, where the likelihood of living with someone, if you're a poor family who has the median income in the U.S. has, fallen in half over this period. So there have been large increases in economic segregation. Racial segregation remains very high, but it's narrowed, which raises important questions. Can we use this experiment to learn a little bit about the impacts of economic versus racial segregation on family outcomes? The second one is a question that's been around for hundreds of years. As Todd noted, we know from observational studies that families living in low-income and distressed neighborhoods fare worse in adult economic outcomes. The children are less likely to do well in school. They end up having shorter life expectancies. They're more involved in crime. On a wide range of measures of distress, there's strong correlations. Observational research has shown that the more stuff you control for, in a regression or whichever way you want to do it, the smaller the neighborhood effects appear to be. That is, when you get families that look truly comparable, but they don't go away, which has led to what in social science is often a game called name that residual. If you really believe in neighborhood effects, you'll call that even after you've controlled for everything, there's still very large unexplained differences. It must be that it's the neighborhood environments that matter. And if you're a skeptic, you'll say, well, you know how many years of schooling someone had, their parents had, but you don't know the quality of it. If you really controlled for it all the way, there wouldn't be anything left for neighborhood environments. And that was sort of the background for setting up this experiment to try to really get a sense of what if we could truly randomize the likelihood that different families who would be observationally and in terms of all the unobservables on average sort of equivalent, what if we could do that and then follow them for a large number of years? And basically, that's what MTO has been able to accomplish. As Todd noted, 4,600 families entered this program and they got randomly assigned, some of them getting help and opportunity to move to low-income neighborhoods out of public housings, other continuing to get their same support. And what I'm going to talk about today is what's happened over the last 15 years in observing these families, and in particular the long-run outcomes. So, as Todd noted, this was authorized in a 1992 urban bill. It's a randomized social experiment. The Clinton administration in '93 worked to make sure that happened. It was open to families living in public housing or project-based assistance in 5 cities: Baltimore, Boston, Los Angeles, New York, and Chicago. To be eligible, it had to be a project or a public housing project in a census tract with over a 40% poverty rate as of 1990. So these are the poorest, highest concentration poverty census tracts, neighborhoods in the United States. The typical family lived in a census tract with a 53% poverty rate at baseline when they were randomized in, which was 5 times the national average. These are the 2 to 3% highest poverty areas in the United States. Families were enrolled from 1994 to 1998. What exactly was the experiment? Basically, the families that signed up, we should think of them as individuals living in public housing and that basically wanted to get a voucher to move. In most of these cities, there were very long waiting lists to get vouchers. In one of the treatment groups, the Section 8, which are now housing. They got a standard Section 8 voucher and no extra special treatment besides what you would get if you had gotten one. In the experimental treatment group, you got a Section 8 voucher, but you could only use it to move to a housing unit in a census tract that had an under 10% poverty rate, so it was below the national average of poverty as of the 1990 census, but there was counseling and help in trying to move. But you should think of this counseling as housing mobility counseling, not general counseling about different aspects of your life. So that's basically what the MTO experiment is. And who are the people who participated in this experiment who we're going to learn something about? Well, they're basically who was living in high poverty public housing projects in the 1990s. They basically had to be poor families with children, so they're not surprisingly disproportionately single female-headed households, disproportionately minority. At the time, right around the time welfare reform was going in, the vast majority were on public assistance, and the vast majority of the household heads, who were the mothers, were not working. Only about a quarter were working. Over the time that MTO took place, there were massive changes in the social safety net. Welfare reform happened, the shift towards work-based assistance, so there were huge employment increases of the mothers in this sample, but that's going to be true for the control group and the treatment group. And of course, while they all started in project-based assistance, many of those units were actually demolished over the time period. So you shouldn't think of the control group as persisting for the last 15 years in the Robert Taylor homes or in the same unit in a Baltimore unit. Most of the people in the control group also move. It's just they don't move with the assistance as early and with the timing of their choosing as do the MTO ones. And we'll see they still end up in very different neighborhoods. In Baltimore and Chicago, it's almost 100% African American. They're much more mixed groups between Hispanics, blacks, and a modest group of poor whites in Boston. LA and New York are largely Hispanic and black. And at every single one of the sites, at the baseline survey, we asked them for why it is they wanted a housing voucher to move, and 3/4 of the families listed essentially concerns with safety, crime, gangs, and violence as by far the most important reason that they wanted to move. Much higher up, schools for kids were modestly important, improving housing quality, looking for work and economic opportunity was almost the null set in the fraction of people who listed that as their motivation. So what did we try to do to learn about this sample? Well, we did a couple of things. We did a large-scale household survey asking both the household heads a wide range of questions about health, education, economic status, physical and mental health, their neighborhoods, their connections, their social capital. We also tried to get a couple kids, focused on kids 10 to 20 at the time of the long-run evaluation from 2008 to 10. So these are largely very young kids at the time of random assignment. Many of them were preschool before that, so we're getting a very long period in which they have been exposed to new neighborhoods. So this is really looking at the group that's now grown up and formed their peer groups in very different types of neighborhoods in the experimental groups versus the control group. And we also supplemented that with a wide range of administrative data, unemployment insurance records to look at earnings and follow them over time, school district information on quality of schools. We did our own achievement test to have similar achievement tests for the kids across all the sites. We also have school measures. We have, public housing and housing assistance information from HUD and a wide range of public assistance information and college information from the National Student Clearinghouse. And in most cases, the survey and the administrative data basically are quite consistent. And we put in great efforts. ISR, the Institute for Survey Research at Michigan, played a major role in implementing the survey, and we got a 90% response rate, which is pretty remarkable 15 years after random assignment, given the typical families here have moved 2 or 3 times. So there was a great tracking effort done by HUD, Apt Associates, and then ISR over the years. What do we look at? The simplest thing you can look at is what's known as an intent to treat estimate. It's basically just comparing the mean outcomes of the people who were randomly allocated a voucher and compare that to the control group. That tells you that's the most kosher thing you can look at. It's basically saying people who had different opportunities to move, that's really the only thing on average that should be different among these groups. There are thousands of them, so all other differences should wipe out according to sampling error. And basically, that tells you if you're given the opportunity to get such a voucher earlier than other families, what has it meant for your life outcome? So that'll just be a simple comparison of means. If you're willing to make one other assumption, which is basically that being offered a housing voucher only affects your outcomes if you actually use the housing voucher, which is probably a pretty reasonable first case assumption, then you can basically inflate those estimates by dividing by the fraction that actually were able to use the housing voucher, the lease-up rate or the compliance rate. That's what's known as a TOTE, the effective treatment on treated. And as we'll see, about half or 47% of the people in the experimental group were able to lease up. You might ask, why doesn't everyone? They all wanted a voucher. Why is it that they all didn't lease up? Well, there are a couple of reasons why. One is you only have a limited time period to do it. 4 to 6 months are the way the Section 8 vouchers worked in this period. And if you're a poor family living in public housing in New York, Boston, in very tight housing markets in the mid-late 1990s, it wasn't so easy to find a unit, particularly if you were restricted to moving to an under 10% poverty area that you could lease up in that time period. So some of it was just the difficulty given the time frame and how tight many of these housing markets are. As it turned out, Los Angeles was a much easier housing market for doing that, for example, than New York, Baltimore, or Chicago. And the second reason, of course, is these are dynamic families. At the time you signed up, maybe you really did want to move, but 3 months later when you got the voucher, it could be that family circle. You'd gotten a job, you had changed, someone else, you were having a new relationship, so there were some, just normal changes in people's lives. But most of it is the difficulty of leasing up. So about half of the experimental group was able to lease up and moved under 10% poverty areas, and about 60% of the Section 8 group. So you can multiply the experimental ones by 2.1 and the Section 8 ones by 1.6 to get what would be the effect on someone who actually used a voucher. So the big question we want to ask is there experiment and a real experiment in terms of the neighborhoods these families lived in, and did it persist? And the answer is there is quite a large experiment in terms of neighborhood environments. What this chart shows you is first at baseline, if you look at the column that says control mean, 53% was the average poverty rate of the neighborhoods these families were living in at baseline at the time of random assignment. And you can see those treatment effects, there's ex-ante identical between the control group, the experimental, and Section 8. This really was random assignment. 1 year after random assignment, the experimental group that moved basically was in areas in 10 to 15% poverty rates. Why weren't they in under 10% areas? That's because in 1996, the place that had a 10% poverty rate in 1990 that you could actually move to with a Section 8 voucher probably had a 15% poverty rate because it was a slightly falling apart neighborhood. That's a lot better than your 53% starting place, but don't think of them as moving to rich neighborhoods. They're moving to the edge of much better neighborhoods, but sort of the edge of those neighborhoods that are somewhat falling apart, but still much nicer. Even 10 years out, there's still substantial differences, but the differences narrow over time. And the differences narrowing is largely because the control group improves where they're living, not because the experimental and Section 8 groups are leaving and getting into worse neighborhoods over time. If you look at the full 15 years since random assignment, on average, the experimental group lived in 9 percentage point lower poverty areas, which is almost 20 percentage points if you actually moved. So it's the difference between spending your time typically in a 40% poverty area and a sort of 15 to 20% area. And the effect is about, 2/3 of that for the Section 8 group. One way to illustrate the differences in the neighborhood environments of these groups is this simple graph. This just gives you the distribution of the typical neighborhood you lived in over the 15 years after random assignment if you were someone who moved with a voucher in the experimental group versus if you were in the control group. And basically that yellow line shows you that, and compared to the red line, that there were very different experiences. The typical experimental mover lived in a census tract with a 10 to 20% poverty rate. On average, they're living at about the 40th percentile of the U.S. sort of median family income or poverty distribution. So don't think of this as upper middle class, but that's well into the range you would usually think of as a pretty good working class area or middle class neighborhood. It's about the 40th percentile. The control group is still, some of them are moving to better neighborhoods, but typically in a 40%, which is still the bottom 5% of neighborhoods in the U.S. in terms of economic isolation. And the other thing to note is there is nobody, 0 people in the experimental group who used a voucher who moved back to an area like they started in with over a 50% poverty rate. So nobody remained who had an opportunity to move back to the equivalent of those ex-ante neighborhoods, whereas a substantial fraction of the control group remain in such neighborhoods. So how big was the impact on other aspects of the neighborhood? They were concerned with safety, and as you can see here, 4 to 7 years out, they were substantially, both in their self-reports as well as many objective measures we have, in safer neighborhoods. They were much more satisfied with their neighborhoods. There was much less graffiti, much less criminal victimization. You can use objective measures of our surveyors walking around, crime rates, or their self-reports here. Again, the differences narrow over time, but that's because the control group moves to better neighborhoods, but there still are large differences 15 years out. What did it mean in terms of other measures? Oops, what happened? Yeah. Other measures of neighborhoods. Basically, the share minority does go down, but they're still, while they're moving into sort of the middle of the income distribution, they're still in disproportionately highly minority areas. Remember, the vouchers were targeted at the poverty rate, not at desegregation by race, so they're much smaller changes, although there are lots of differences by site. Large increases in median household income, of almost a doubling if you do the tote for the experimental groups, and large improvements that narrow over time in housing quality, much more modest changes in the school the kids are in. So the typical kid went from the 18th percentile school in the control group only to the 22nd percentile school in the experimental. So a very important fact to keep in mind, Moving to Opportunity is a residential mobility program. It had very large effects on neighborhood safety, on neighborhood education of who your neighbors are, on the poverty of your neighbors. It didn't change your school peers nearly as much. And if you look at the geography of the maps, the families tended to be living at the edge of neighborhoods where the rent was lower, so you could use a Section 8 voucher, and you basically didn't get into the better attendance zone district where rents would have been higher. So schools changed much less than did neighborhoods. What did this mean for outcomes? So basically, what we see 10 to 15 years out is, let's put it through, what we saw 1 year out and what we saw 5 years out were large improvements on a wide range of measures of health, both mental and physical health. For the adults, they were less depressed, much less psychologically distressed. Their concerns about safety of their kids were greatly ameliorated being in safer neighborhoods, and rates of clinical depression in single moms living in high poverty areas are quite high, and they were substantially reduced by access to better neighborhoods. And similarly, we find substantial persistent impacts on physical health outcomes that we can actually measure. We can weigh people, and we actually did physically weigh them. So obesity goes down substantially for the opportunity to move to better neighborhoods and be less distressed, potentially change diet and exercise. Untreated diabetes fell substantially. Measures of physical disabilities also fell substantially. So health and well-being measures improved dramatically. This is a long-standing view. One of the initial motivations for public housing was actually to get people into healthier environments. So getting out of public housing seems to have had a very large payoff. But what we saw 1 year out, what we saw 5 years out, and 10 to 15 years out is in a technical term, it didn't do doodly squat for your economic outcomes. Essentially, 1 to 2% changes that are not large enough to be statistically significant in either direction on almost every measure of earnings, employment. So large changes in health improvements, safety, your social networks, you're hanging out with more educated individuals. People did not become more socially isolated, but it didn't translate. So if your view was spatial mismatch, if you got people to somewhat more thriving neighborhoods, you would greatly change their economic outcomes, or you changed who their peers were in terms of employment, it didn't show up being a very powerful mechanism. The other barriers to employment of single women with limited education seem to be much more important. This basically summarizes in the most conservative way what we take here are indices of the outcomes for physical health and mental health that we ex ante specified more than 5 years before the long run evaluation. So it actually doesn't use our best data. In the long run evaluation, we were actually able to collect biomarkers, blood spots, by pricking people's fingers, something HUD wasn't very happy for us to be doing before this technology developed, 10 years ago and 15 years ago. So that's not in this index. We'll show some larger outcomes there, but if you put together these indices, things like irregular sleep, questions about depression, questions about weight, you see basically 0.05 to 0.1 standard deviation improvements in the health measures, just about statistically significant. And I will also point out larger improvements in happiness, subjective well-being, and that's going to be an interesting outcome. And if anything, slightly negative on economic self-sufficiency. If you look at individual outcomes, depression, 20% of the control group is clinically depressed. There are significant reductions, especially if you look at the totes. Psychological distress improved. This would be an FDA clinically approved trial in terms of antidepressants and psychological distress. One of the most distressing aspects of this population is 35% of the women in the control group are extremely obese, obesity number 2, BMI over 35. 20% would be if you went to BMI over 40. There's a huge problem of obesity in poor U.S. populations as well everywhere. And Moving to Opportunity had substantial reductions in extreme obesity, which is one of the largest and most important health cost factors out there, and similarly showed up with substantial clinically significant, and this is based on actual blood tests, not on self-reports of untreated diabetes. Substantial improvements there of clinical value, and we have a paper in the New England Journal of Medicine that documents this more carefully. What about the youth? So for the adults, improvements in health, not much on economic outcome. For kids, we had great hopes that getting to better neighborhoods would improve school achievement. Again, nothing showed up in interim and nothing much in the long term. One hypothesis is the very limited change in school environments relative to neighborhood environments. Physical health, not much going on. We do find continuing improvements for girls in mental health measures, and something Susan will have interesting things to say about in the change in environments. And we did, getting people removed from drug gangs did seem to have persistent impacts in keeping them out of getting arrested for drug-related crimes, although the overall arrest rates were not very different. So what's the bottom line for what MTO did? Was it a success? There are many different ways of measuring it. If you said, as an anti-poverty policy, does giving housing vouchers in the range of neighborhoods you could move in a large city with a Section 8 voucher do much for removing poverty of the adults or intergenerational poverty? There's no evidence here that suggests by itself housing vouchers, even with help moving to better neighborhoods, does much for poverty and economic distress. On the other hand, it seems to do a lot for physical and mental health, and if we let the families themselves define their well-being by answers to questions, a standard question about happiness, they said what they wanted was improvements in safety. They actually got that in large fold, and what do they actually say over the long run? What we did is we included, one, so we couldn't do a fishing expedition of having 20 different measures of subjective well-being. One standard question from the General Social Survey on happiness or subjective well-being, which has been shown in much work to be strongly correlated both with things like fMRIs of brain functioning, as well as how much your spouse or friends think you're happy or sad, as well as all sorts of physical and mental health types of outcomes, blood pressure, indicators of distress. So we think it's a pretty good summary measure. And basically what you find is if you view the families themselves as the arbiters of whether this was a success, and we compare those who were given the option to move that those who didn't, there were substantial and statistically significant improvements in happiness or subjective well-being of the adult household heads in the range of 0.1 standard deviations for an ITT or a fifth of a standard deviation for the movers. What that means is that's the size of the black-white happiness gap in the United States, and it's the size of what the difference is with families with $20,000 more income than others. So the bottom line is MTO had substantial impacts on neighborhood environments. They narrowed over time, but they were still quite substantial over 15 years. They delivered in terms of what the families said they wanted, which is improved safety. They led to improvements in mental and physical health, some quite distinctive on important things, obesity and diabetes. Very little for economic opportunity, very little for the kids' outcomes, although in terms of safety and mental health of girls, there were some improvements. The families themselves would view it as a success. It looks more like what I would call moving to tranquility than moving to opportunity, if opportunity is economic and educational opportunity. The other question, a scientific question, is what were the mediating factors, and this is quasi-experimental rather than experimental, that led to bigger improvements in health and well-being of these families. And there are multiple candidate things. You know, there are theories that say it's racial isolation that's important, theories that say it's economic isolation, theories that talk about safety. What we found is the two factors that really mattered, using the fact that we have 5 different sites and 3 different treatment groups across sites, are the bigger the improvement in neighborhood poverty, the bigger the reduction in economic isolation of your neighbors, the bigger improvements in health and well-being, and the greater the improvements in neighborhood safety. There was very little relationship between changes in racial and ethnic segregation and the outcomes. So bottom line is, you know, a mixed bag of outcomes, but for what the families themselves said they valued the most, I think it was a very valuable intervention, but one shouldn't view housing mobility per se in the range that we think is feasible with this level of support as being a solution for long-run poverty.
And Susan Clampet-Lundquist, to take the perspective of a little bit more about why do we suppose we did or did not see some of the findings we have.
So I also don't have a list of everybody that contributed to the research that I'm going to be talking about. I'm going to kind of be skimming over a lot of different qualitative research studies that happened, especially 2 research studies that took place in 2003 and 2004. Both of those studies relied heavily on in-depth interviews, where it would be more like a conversation, less like a survey, open-ended questions to try to get people to tell their stories, because we were really about what are the processes that are going on here. Both of the studies also had an ethnographic component. So there was one of these research studies took place in Baltimore and Chicago, which I was involved in. Our ethnographic component involved school observations, because we wanted to find out, you know, why don't we see improvements in academic achievement. The other study took place in New York, Boston, and LA, and I'll refer to that as a 3-city study. And their ethnographic component involved hanging out with young adults, with adults trying to go on their daily routines with them to try to figure out what kind of things were going on with them. So in brief, the qualitative data remind us that the policy story is a lot more complicated than low poverty neighborhoods equaling better outcomes. This can be the case for many people, but we have to figure out other questions on the individual level, such as who benefits and how, and also on the neighborhood level, such as what kind of low poverty neighborhood and how long one must stay in order to benefit. One of the things that really has excited me about being involved in MTO research over the past several years is that we've been able to benefit from the strengths of quantitative and qualitative research by working in tandem with the research teams. And these two qualitative studies that I'm going to be talking about really focus on research puzzles that came out of the interim evaluation survey. And I'm going to be focusing on those domains today. The first one I'm going to talk about is adult economic self-sufficiency. And as Larry mentioned, the survey didn't find significant differences either at the time of the interim evaluation or at the final impacts evaluation. In the MTO qualitative study in Baltimore, we were able to match up experimental compliers, so those who had used their voucher to move, and control likely compliers. So we did a matching process to find out who in the control group might have used the voucher were they given one. So I'll call those control likely compliers. In terms of, we wanted to look at these two groups to analyze what were the different processes going on for why we don't see significant results in terms of economic self-sufficiency. So in both the experimental and the control group, a portion of the adults were extremely disadvantaged in terms of educational background, work experience, mental and physical health issues, some of which might have been triggered by living in such high poverty neighborhoods. And these barriers weren't explicitly addressed by MTO. And for this group of people who may not have been work ready, a move to a low poverty neighborhood simply wasn't enough. And this was found in the 3-city study as well. Though the experimental group members were more likely to report having working neighbors, they didn't get informal advice about jobs from them. So the local social ties did not work out as anticipated, thinking, well, people are going to be moving to low poverty neighborhoods, they'll talk to their neighbors in order to get job contacts from them. That really didn't happen. They usually reported that their neighbors were in professions that were very different from theirs, professions that required higher educational levels or different work experience than they themselves had. So their job networks really weren't in sync with one another. Many of the respondents also worked low-wage jobs in the health sector. And I'm talking here particularly about Baltimore, in hospitals and nursing homes. And in this metropolitan area, most of the jobs were located in Baltimore or on the fringe of the city, suburb boundaries. So for some of our respondents, moving out to low-poverty suburban neighborhoods, not on regular public transit lines, meant being farther from job opportunities. And the 3-city study researchers found similar results for Los Angeles. So while adults in the experimental group were more likely to talk about neighbors who work, what's important here is that this in itself can't boost employment rates among people who are not already employed. And for those who are unemployed but don't have significant health or childcare barriers, a neighborhood climate structured by employment routines may be an encouragement to adults to find work, but they probably won't hear about leads from their neighbors if our data tell us anything. And it also may take time for the neighborhood climate to make a difference for adults or youth. So the 1 year required of the experimental group, that they needed to stay in that low poverty neighborhood for 1 year, may not have been enough. For those dependent on public transit, moving to some of these neighborhoods may in fact depress employment. And so these data really highlight for us that looking beyond the average experience of a person in the experimental group or the control group can be helpful policy-wise if we look beyond that, because there's a lot of different subgroups that have different needs and abilities. So the next topic I want to talk about is adult mental health. And we saw that MTO did have some impact on adult mental health, maybe a little bit more significantly at the time of the interim evaluation than the final evaluation, but still there was something there. And so there was a study that was done using qualitative data from Baltimore, again using the matched low poverty complier group with the control likely complier group. And they explored what might be underlying this mental health benefit seen in the survey data. So similar to the survey data, they found differences in how they perceived the physical environment of the neighborhood. And on average, controls spent a few years more in high poverty neighborhoods compared to experimental compliers, which you would expect. What the people in the experimental complier group reported is that there was this shift from being in an environment where they had pest infestation, poor quality housing, unreliable elevators in high-rise buildings where when they broke down you would have to climb up flights of steps with groceries or strollers, to neighborhoods where you could actually hear crickets and birds and see squirrels and not have so much concrete around you. There was also a change in the social environment as well. So people in the experimental group discussed differences in seeing more neighbors in a working routine or people involved in snow cleanup. And there were radical differences in terms of exposure to community violence, with controls reporting seeing more people selling drugs or seeing more shootings, and the experimental group people rarely reporting these types of activities. So, this is a possible mediator to what we're seeing with mental health gain. What kind of explicit link was seen in the data where, did people actually say, because of this, this is how I feel? Some people did, and I have a quote up here from Amy, who was in the experimental group, and she struggled with a host of mental health problems, such as depression, anger, and phobias. And even though her move with an MTO voucher didn't ameliorate all of these problems, she did say that the change in the physical environment really improved her outlook on life. She said, moving up here, it's a whole different atmosphere. The greenery, you're living in a high-rise, you get a lot of cement, and there's something to that effect in the psychology. The hardness you get from all that concrete. The greenery, it softens you. It's just so beautiful and peaceful, the space and the open space. And so this kind of really speaks to this moving to tranquility that you're talking about here. Now I want to talk a little bit about adolescent mental health, because we also saw this benefit just for girls, though, rather than boys. In the 3-city study, Popkin and others found that girls that were in low-poverty neighborhoods were less likely to be subjected to verbal and physical harassment by men and boys on the street than their counterparts in high-poverty neighborhoods. And so they suggest that this reduction in fear of harassment or of having to consciously strategize about how to avoid it might be the driving force behind the differences that we saw in mental health in the survey for girls, but not for boys. There was also an analysis conducted comparing Baltimore experimental complier males and females with control males and females in order to try to explore patterns from their stories that relate to mental health. This qualitative analysis found clearer differences, actually, between the experimental and the control group than gender differences within the groups. For example, the stressors that were found, that were reported by people in the control group, were really of a much more serious nature than those in the experimental complier group. For example, you might have similar people saying, yes, I felt anxious in the last month, or yes, I felt angry in the last month, but the actual qualitative reasons for what drove their anxiety were very different. So you might have people in the experimental group saying, well, my parents were always on me to get the chores done. And people in the control group, talking about, witnessing violence in their neighborhood or in their home environment. Similar difference that we saw with death. So youth in the experimental group, more talking about natural deaths that happen in their family. Those in the control group, more likely to talk about deaths from violence or from drug-related deaths. Anger was also a mental health issue that sprang up spontaneously from the interviews. We actually didn't ask about it in this interviews in the 2003-2004 study. Significantly, no experimental team talked about having serious issues with anger, whereas 40% of the males in the control group talked about this. In terms of exposure to community violence and disorder, the control group members, similar to their parents, were more likely to report much more intense drug trafficking and violence in their neighborhoods. I have a story up here from a young woman named Ashanti who was in the control group in Baltimore. And she said, she was talking about a shooting that happened in front of her house fairly soon before we interviewed her. She said, we saw him walk past us, but I don't know if he was arguing or they said he was trying to buy something, but the man didn't have anything, so he just shot him in the face. Everybody was screaming and hollering, trying to get in their house while we were just sitting there. And the boy walked. After he shot him, he walked back toward us. Out of fear of retribution, Ashanti's mother ordered them not to say anything to the police, and she told police that she hadn't seen anything. And then she saw the shooter a few weeks later walking on the street. So this is just an example of of what we're talking about when we're talking about exposure to community violence. And the interview data make it clear that the control teens were still living in neighborhoods that exposed them to more drug traffic and more shooting than those in the experimental group who used their voucher to move. And this might have consequences for their mental health. We know from other research studies that certainly there's a connection between exposure to community violence and disorder and mental health outcomes such as anger, anxiety, and depression. So let's stay with the teens and talk about adolescent risk behavior. The survey findings on risk behavior for adolescents, especially the survey findings back at the time of the interim evaluation, point to a similar pattern as mental health, that low-income girls were able to take advantage of this move to a low-poverty neighborhood in a way that boys weren't. So to try to understand what social processes might underlie this treatment group by gender interaction, a research team analyzed in-depth interviews of a subsample of 86 Baltimore teens from Baltimore and Chicago, from experimental families who moved to low-poverty neighborhoods and also control families. And I'm just going to talk about a couple of our findings. The first one was that we found that hanging out routines that boys had grown accustomed to in their high-poverty neighborhoods didn't fit in well to the low-poverty environment that they were in. And in fact, their routines of hanging out in public space, like either on a corner or at a basketball court, may have made them subject to increased surveillance by police and by neighbors. And in contrast, girls' hanging out routines, which were focused more on hanging out on their porch or in their friends' living rooms or talking on the phone or going to the mall or, in Baltimore's case, going down to the Inner Harbor, really didn't conflict with norms of low-poverty neighborhoods. And of course, as we saw in the data, many of the families in the MTO experimental group didn't stay in their low-poverty neighborhoods. They moved back to higher poverty neighborhoods, although certainly not the same as they were exposed to at the baseline. But we found evidence that the experimental boys may not have had as many finely honed skills of navigating their neighborhoods as the control boys did. And so, sometimes in certain neighborhoods, knowing how to navigate the neighborhood, knowing how to get around, can really be a matter of life or death, or certainly of getting involved in risk behavior. I have an example here of a young man named Scott, who was a 16-year-old boy in the control group, and he had lived in his low-rise housing development in Baltimore all of his life. And he had a pretty good sense of the geography of danger on the corners or in the courtyards of his development, and he also had a really strict mother who helped to encourage him to steer clear of these areas. And he said, I know the guys on the corners, but they're not my friends. They're into drugs and loitering and stuff like I don't really do. I mind my business. And so his quote here is really an illustration of how control boys were more likely than the experimental boys to have reported deploying this strategy, often referred to as staying to myself, where boys specifically avoided associating with others to circumvent trouble. But ultimately, the primary lesson to draw from this research is that boys and girls from similar backgrounds simply live in different social worlds. And so in the face of an intervention like MTO, these underlying differences may create dramatically varied risk and opportunities. The last topic that I wanted to address was children's educational achievement, and to just dig a little bit beneath the numbers in thinking about what was going on here with why we didn't find significant differences in academic achievement. And as Larry mentioned, there weren't really dramatic differences in the actual school environments, especially when we compare with the differences in the neighborhood environments between the experimental and the control groups. So what happened? Well, the short answer is that a move to a low-poverty neighborhood didn't always translate into an increase in school quality for kids. In many cases, kids were still going to school in the same poor-quality school district that they were in when they were living in a high-poverty neighborhood. And even though we do have school variation within the school district, you're still in a poor-quality school district. And the barriers to lease up in a neighborhood with a high-quality school were quite plentiful. This residential choice then circumscribed their school choice. The longer answer involves parental decision-making around schools. And the MTO three-city study researchers and also the qualitative research team for Baltimore explored the decision-making of parents in the experimental group and came up with similar findings. Parents often didn't have good information with which to make decisions about the academic quality of the schools that their kids would be going to, if there was a certain amount of latitude of choice. They relied on their own experiences or the experiences of their networks to learn about schools. And since a large portion of the MTO sample had not graduated from high school or had attended poor quality schools themselves, many of them were making decisions about schools for their kids with an information set about schools that didn't always include academic performance. For many parents, understandably, safety was the key concern. And once that standard was met, they felt comfortable about the school their child attended. For example, in the 3-city study, some parents reported keeping their children at their original schools because they were familiar with the gang guidelines at the school. So they knew what kind of colors to wear or not to wear. And they worried about putting their child in an environment where they would have to relearn different rules. An analysis of the in-depth interview data in Baltimore found that most parents in the MTO sample focused less on academics and more about other characteristics of schools, such as how close the school was to their house or to their family's house where they might be staying during the week, or to their parents' work, or to whether or not they had school uniforms, or other kind of indicators of discipline at the school. Moreover, the instability in their lives, either ranging from moving or from deaths in the family, made it so that it was difficult dealing with a school bureaucracy for that kind of change. Or parents also talked about how, look, we've got so much instability in this area in our lives, we want to make sure that our kid stays at the same school because that's at least one area of stability for them. So there were a lot of things going on here. Despite the constrained residential choices and the limited information set for many parents, some were very explicit to the interviewers about how they wanted their move with MTO to also change their children's academic opportunities for the better. One example of this is Barbara, who moved out of Baltimore to the county, and she was happy with the increased extracurricular activities at her child's new school. And she explained that she wanted to make this move because she was worried that if she didn't get her daughter out of city schools, quote, she wasn't going to make it. And so these qualitative findings show that school choices need to be a more explicit part of housing mobility counseling if that's one of our goals. Because simply moving with a voucher to a less poor neighborhood does not equal a better school. And instead, like all of these domains that I've discussed, there's complicated underlying issues that make this outcome less likely. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. Mike, do you want to sit or? Absolutely. Mike really needs no introduction.
I just don't ever turn down an invitation to come back to HUD and visit, and so I appreciate being here. I'd like to start by saying hello, regional economists. When I was last here, you guys played an enormously important role in the department, and I remember one of my first assignments from Secretary Cisneros, who sat on the Dallas Federal Reserve Board. He said we should have a housing market report like the Fed Beige Book. And that's the genesis of housing market conditions, and I'm enormously proud that publication continues to exist today, and it could not without the tremendous work of you folks out there, so congratulations. I'm here in a peculiar capacity, and so I have to start by, and this has to do with my never turning an invitation down to come back. I'm now in this peculiar capacity in which I am a member of the administration and I'm at Treasury working on pretty significant housing issues, but I'm here really because of a prior role I've played, and so normally I'm talking about A, with prepared remarks, B, I am speaking about policy of the administration, and that's not the case really today. I'm asked to kind of reflect on some things about my role in MTO and some decisions we made kind of early on, and so I have to say that these really are my my own opinions and not those of the administration. And I'm going to talk from kind of three perspectives. You know, one as a grant maker, really from the MacArthur Foundation. One as somebody who was here at the time MTO began, and then just kind of reflect on just a couple of the findings. I will not really comment on future policies or whatever. It's just not appropriate for me here. But I do want to start with a couple of comments, one about Todd and the other about Erica. If that rapid fire presentation of market by market housing data is like candy to you, Todd, you must have a hell of a sweet tooth. It's really rich. It's hard to really digest it all, but boy, when you look at that quarterly newsletter, particularly during times like this, with what's happening on rents and housing prices and all, incredibly valuable, and I really appreciate it. The other is about Erica. It is true. I was Director of Housing and Policy at MacArthur, but it was Erica who brought Moving to Opportunity to me. She didn't know I had anything to do with it when I was at HUD. And so it's not that I wouldn't have supported it. I was brand new at MacArthur and didn't know how to engineer something as big and as complicated a grant through the process, the internal process and the board, and to work with a federal agency and a couple of other federal agencies. And it was really Erica who did it, and I wanted to really add my thanks and congratulations to her. But the second thing that Todd did not mention is, you know, the MacArthur support for MTO was really in two grants. The first was made, and Todd came back to Erica and said, I think we have a chance of collecting some health data through biomarkers. And this is really an incredible opportunity, not cheap. And I'm not sure that HUD had ever done this before. And Todd came to us and Erica, and we kind of worked through the process of how HUD, with the General Counsel and the ethics issues of collecting biomarker data and so on. And it turns out, of course, to have been really tremendously important. And that, again, would not have happened without Erica's persistence and all the support that we got from Todd and HUD. So I want to start there. The policy kind of context. Henry Cisneros spent a lot of time spending evenings and sleeping in public housing units with families, getting to kind of know what their lives were like. And I just want to kind of start with a quote from Henry in one of his speeches about the housing. This happens to be Chicago. It happens to be after spending a couple of nights sleeping with a family in Robert Taylor homes. And this is really the kind of beginning of the Gautreaux and so on. This is how he described it. In these enclaves of poverty, people have been literally cut off from the rest of society, with low wage or no jobs, living where gangs and drug dealers control the stairwells, where children can't go outside to play, where mothers put their infants to bed in bathtubs and erect mattresses in the windows at night to protect their families from stray bullets. This is really what we have heard that families were really interested in getting away from with Moving to Opportunity. And if you fast forward to MacArthur for a minute, you know, at foundations, you don't make individual grants. I mean, from your standpoint, from Larry's standpoint, from Susan's standpoint, it's a big deal. This is the grant. But you don't have a big bucket of money to make individual grants. Grants are really individual projects are part of kind of what we call grant-making strategies. And so the question is, where does moving to opportunity have a home in the grant program, the domestic, and housing program. And really, it's about, from my standpoint, it was about mixed income housing policy. And you can think about mixed income housing policy from both the supply and demand sides. You can try to, through interventions like mobility-oriented and choice-oriented voucher programs like MTO, and give people an opportunity to move to areas that are low poverty and more economically diverse. You can build like Hope 6 and choice neighborhoods and try to develop kind of supply-side mixed income. But the fact of the matter, I saw MTO as part of this kind of larger mixed income issue where we were making incredibly ambitious, I don't know if we call them assertions, hypotheses, propositions about really the benefits to families of moving into these areas. I mean, this is why the economic effects really we talk about as being kind of disappointing, because there were really economic hypotheses about how moving to these areas would really improve jobs and incomes and so on. So we supported moving to opportunity as part of this kind of larger area of interest. And it struck me, and it strikes me to this day, that A, these hypotheses are under-tested, and where we do have an empirical kind of evidence, the results are mixed. And so we really need to continue these kinds of inquiries. Every one of our mixed, in my view, again, personal, in my view, all of our mixed income, whether they're supply or demand side, there are added costs. That is, if you think about the counterfactual, whether it's conventional public housing or conventional choice housing, choice vouchers, those voucher costs in the main program are less than when you combine the search counseling with the added costs of moving to kind of low poverty neighborhoods. Or if you think about the unit costs of a Hope 6 development, the question is, are the added costs, are the benefits that flow to families and communities, do they at least equal or exceed the additional costs? And these questions are going to become increasingly important as fiscal consolidation gets more kind of intense. And so I think we just need to really have more rigorous and robust research like this, and I really appreciate the quality and robustness of this program. I told Todd that I had neither the time nor, given my age, the memory capability of the decisions we made and why, and there are books on it, so that I won't dwell on it. But as this event came closer, I tried to kind of go and see if I had some notes and think about things. So I will just give you a very quick sense of my recollections of why we did certain things or didn't. Firstly, I found out as I went back and thought about this that even though it was the 92 Act and the Clinton administration really implemented moving to opportunity, the idea for it and the lobbying efforts by Alex Polikoff in Chicago, who's a public interest lawyer, very, very, was really the spearhead for the Gautreaux litigation and so on. He brought the original Gautreaux lawsuit and also brought to HUD this idea, and it was really Jack Kemp and the Republican administration that really had an interest in it, and we, in the Clinton administration, actually, it became part of the legislation we implemented, but it really has kind of bipartisan roots to it, which is interesting to keep in mind. The research motivation was really to do a more formal, rigorous test of the Gautreaux demonstration, which was court-ordered in the Chicago metropolitan area, where There were some very positive outcomes, but unclear whether or not you could attribute them to the families moving to Chicago suburbs. And so the idea here was to be much more formal and rigorous with a random control trial, which the Gautreaux pilot was not. So the first question is, what kind of neighborhoods should be the treatment neighborhoods? And big debates. Remember, Gautreaux is court-ordered, and so race is an allowable in that remedy. Race is, you're able to define eligible neighborhoods racially and ethnically and so on. We were told by, as I recall, by our general counsel that we could not use race or ethnicity to identify eligible neighborhoods. And so poverty became the proxy, and we kind of looked at this correlation and so on. But it's interesting to hear, Larry, because I'm not sure in the APAM results or something, maybe I just didn't hear it, but there is something kind of reassuring in a way on your findings that whether it was defined racially or by poverty, you didn't see the connection. I hadn't at least picked that up before, because really the question then becomes one of, okay, if we can't use race, so forget that, but what poverty level do we set as for treatment neighborhoods? And I do remember this conversation and how we arrived, at least is my recollection, of the 10% limit. I mean, some people wanted to go down, even far below that. Some really would be content to be a little higher than 10. As I recall it, and I could be wrong, but as I recall it, the question was, can we have a reasonable supply of units in these treatment neighborhoods that families could actually find within the FMR or the exception rents? So you can say 5%, you could say 2% poverty. Like, the question is whether there's a null housing inventory there. And so you're kind of balancing. You want people to have an opportunity to find housing in these neighborhoods. And so that was kind of the 10% issue that I remember. Another one that I kind of remember, but I don't really have a great in-depth kind of recollection of this, but there is a paradox of how long a person you're testing, right? You're testing the neighborhood effects. So the question is, should a mobility choice design housing program limit choice and mobility? Right? I mean, that question comes up in how long should we require a family to live in a non-poverty neighborhood before they can move into a neighborhood of their choice, even if it violates the kind of 10%. And so this year issue became, I have seen critiques of MTO and mobility-oriented voucher programs about whether we should have limited people and made sure people live there a couple of years more. There are still ideas that get floated up that we should have a choice, whether it's a portion of the program, but really mandate long-term requirements for people and so on. But the 1 year was, kind of a design decision. The third one was really important because I still believe, Larry, to this day, that I didn't get a job offer from Harvard because of my answer to this question. Shortly after I left the department, I was invited by David Elwood, who was right in the administration and was back at Harvard for an interview for a position in the school design at Kennedy School. And I decided to give my kind of job lecture. I mean, here I had been teaching for 100 years. Before that, was in the administration. And I go and give this talk, and it gets into control group questions. And really, the social scientists in the room could not understand why we did not have a control group from the voucher list, non-public housing, why it was limited to public housing. And that turns out, of course, to be an important issue because you really can't generalize the results of MTO to the general voucher population for a number of reasons. And I talked about Gautreaux, and I talked about this being a derivative of that and the legislation. And, social science scholars find those things not terribly good reasons if you don't have a good theoretical kind of reason. So I still think to this day I would have been at Harvard were it not for not having a control group from the general population. The last thing I kind of remember is the mobility counseling issue. We probably could have done a better job of either standardizing or really studying separately the role that mobility counseling played in housing choices because the programs were quite different and so on. But just to give you a sense, we talk about treatment and we talk about controls and we talk about percentages, but there was a mobility counseling component to the Gautreaux court-ordered litigation. And here's a quote from a mobility counselor in Chicago, the precursor to MTO. These are mostly African-American mothers with young children, which is exactly really what the population was in MTO. This is in the Gautreaux demonstration. Here's the quote. "This is the hardest thing most of these women have ever been asked to do. They are so used to being talked down to, shown no respect, that our counselors have to make them feel worthy, have confidence in themselves before they go out and try to sell themselves to landlords as prospective tenants. We're not going to do it for you. You have to do it yourself, or it won't mean anything to you," we say. "But if you stand up, we'll be there with you," and we are. I mean, it really just gives you a sense of what families were facing as they signed up to be kind of randomized into this program, and it makes you think about the importance of the support that these programs provide, and I suspect there's something we can do more there. I also recall, and some of you may, the incredibly contentious national, and I mean, to talk about a contentious national political environment sounds, yeah, right. But if you go back, 1994, contract with America, the first Republican majority in the House in 44 years, this department was on the chopping block. Very contentious. And so we have a conflation and a confluence of national political forces, but also, I don't know if many of you remember, but as we were getting ready and in the very early stages of implementing Moving to Opportunity, HUD was also in the early stages of, we had just eliminated, Congress had just eliminated as part of the administration's request, one-for-one replacement. A lot of this terrible housing, much of which was really vacant and boarded up, could now be demolished. An announcement was made in Baltimore that these public housing, they're not high-rises, most of them, but these public housing complexes along the outer rim of Center City were going to be coming down. This is at a time where Baltimore is a site of moving to opportunity, 285 family, I mean, very small number of families. All of a sudden, MTO becomes part of Maryland electoral politics and quite vicious and a very, very difficult times. So the expansion of the program was limited. We found some resources to keep the program alive in Baltimore, but you have to appreciate this was kind of a precursor to Hope 6, and all of these kind of issues came to the fore. And HUD and the program was subjected to enormous pressures. So finally, let me just make three kind of concluding points, two substantive, and then a third kind of summary. Even though it wasn't part of the original design, really MTO has begun to seed a health-based rationale for this kind of housing and this kind of intervention, and I think it's really important. And it's easy for me to ask the question that I'm going to ask. It's incredibly hard to answer it in a way that would have resource implications. But the question, as simply put as I can put it out, is do the health benefits that Larry Katz talked about on significant reductions in extreme obesity and the reduction in the incidence of type 2 diabetes, do those health benefits reduce the Medicare costs that these families would impose, these individuals would impose on the system to more than pay for the cost of their housing assistance? I mean, this issue of whether or not housing as an intervention really helps create or accelerates or magnifies the benefits in other areas in which the government is providing support to families, I think is a very important question, very complicated to address. There also is, for those of you who really, we did at MacArthur when we had a grant program called How Housing Matters to Families and Communities, you have housing as a platform, as a theme. I think buried in the findings of the MTO report is support for HUD's housing as a platform strategy. And I will quote from the report. For adults, and this really comes out where there weren't a whole lot of economic benefits, quote, for adults, it appears that training, education, and employment services directly enhance marketable skills, and changes in work incentives more directly affect labor market and economic outcomes of low-income adults than do the indirect effects of changes in neighborhood environments, at least in the range observed in the MTO demonstration. So the point, I think, as I read that is you really need to link kind of human capital programs with these kind of mobility programs if you have a hope of really increasing marketable skills and ultimately incomes in human capital. So I think that's important, and it's really not one of the headline results. Finally, as good as this work is, and as proud as I am to be linked with it, even if it's just as a political person and a funder, that's not anybody who has made really intellectual contributions here for it. I will say this, I don't think any study, no matter how well designed in this complex area in which we're working, is enough to move the dial of policy significantly. I mean, really what we look for is the center of gravity of lots of studies that either kind of begin to surround a kind of a finding or a consensus, so that I think we do need, and I'm really thrilled to see HUD is involved with many more now random control trials, which I think are hugely important, that would not have happened without the legacy of MTO. But I just want to bring one grant that I made that you may not be aware of in the results of it, and I will conclude with this. I supported, and it has been published now in a new book by Doug Massey at Woodrow Wilson School, It's called Climbing Mount Laurel, and it really is about the low-income housing that was built in Mount Laurel as a result of a series of 3 New Jersey Supreme Court cases. But Doug, this was lottery assignment, and Doug had the original lottery assignments from Mount Laurel, from this history, and was able to actually do a 10-year kind of study of the people that was selected and moved into the new Ethel Lawrence homes that finally got built, and those who were eligible but did not. And he has published the results in a book, and the very similar results on mental health, very similar results on crime and victimization and fears and perceptions and so on. The one thing, though, that is hugely different is they found very significant labor market earnings and work benefits. And so that's the first kind of mixed income study that I have seen of significant economic benefits, and I supported a good bit of panel data studies on economic effects of vouchers, and I had not seen it before, and I just want to bring your attention to this study. It's called Climbing Mount Laurel. With that, I'll close, and thank you.
Thank you, Mike. So it's 3:45, and we do have to be out of here at 4 p.m. So if you have questions, please line up at the microphone. And for the folks that are watching the webcast, Will, what is it that they need to do to pass along their questions?
Yes, they can send their email queries to PDR quarterly update at HUD.gov. All caps PDRQ and U in update. PDR quarterly update at HUD.gov, and we will field them for you.
Okay, if you can remember that. So why don't we move to questions here? First up.
Okay. Good afternoon. My question is for Larry. I was a little surprised by your finding that economic integration matters more than racial integration. And I see that it's a within-study finding based on a study that wasn't really designed to answer this question. But on the other hand, if we examine the findings from Gautreaux and compare them with MTO findings, one significant difference is that Gautreaux was a program that resulted in economic integration and very positive earnings and schooling impacts, economic impacts. And the MTO demonstration didn't have those impacts. I'd be curious to know about the Mount Laurel study, whether that resulted in greater racial integration in addition to the mixed income situation. And I don't know about that yet, but I do know that that study also showed good school impacts in addition to earnings. And so I think it's still an open question, but just going broadly by impressions, comparing different studies, especially comparing Gautreaux with MTO, one would be inclined to believe that economic integration is very important. That racial integration is probably even more important. So if you have a comment on that.
Yeah. So, right. The first thing to note is that the MTO study only covers racial integration in a limited range, because even in the sites with the largest changes, they're pretty modest. And what we can say is if you look across the sites and treatment groups, you find the bigger the change between sort of treatment and control groups in average poverty or other measures of economic isolation, the bigger the improvements on almost all range of outcomes, the bigger the change in racial integration. It's pretty much flat, and conditioning on the economic integration. If anything, it goes in the wrong direction. Gautreaux, I have a couple comments. Gautreaux was targeted to racial integration, but it also had a lot of economic, so just the findings that Gautreaux's big doesn't really separate them out. When Greg Duncan and his collaborators have done the longer term analyses, they also find it really was those that persisted in lower poverty areas, even though all of them were in racially integrated areas, were the ones that had much larger benefits. So it's much more consistent. The original Gautreaux findings of very large impacts on kids' schooling and stuff, the longer run evaluations find everything much more muted, which appears to be for a couple reasons. One is that there probably was the original Rosenbaum study only found about half the people they were trying to find, so the administrative data had a more representative sample, and a lot of the effects seem to have faded away over time. But there's still something going on, but it isn't actually that different than MTO when it's 15 years out. The other thing I would note is there have been several other quasi-experimental studies of people leaving public housing, the Chicago demolition studies, the true housing voucher random assignment that's happened in Chicago in recent years, and Toronto has had one, and those are looking at kids, had very limited impact. So I'm quite eager to see the Mount Laurel one, which is a new study, which does seem to be one that if it really is with the lottery and, really tracked them up, might be our first, I think, compelling evidence in that direction. My understanding is it's targeted in several units, very different, not the sort of mobility spreading out.
Absolutely.
So it's a different model, but it'll be very interesting to try to understand that. But yes, there are a lot of open questions.
Yeah. I mean, I can just fill you in just briefly. Really, the Mount Laurel is much more part of what I would call a suite of research efforts around inclusionary zoning. And we've supported work by Heather Schwartz of RAND, in which she finds has written an article called Housing Policy is School Policy, or School Policy is Housing, whatever, but it really, her 11-site study really does show that folks that live in the inclusionary zoning units that were built, the affordable units in these places that don't have a whole lot of affordable units, really are attending, and it's not at the student level performance, but are attending higher rated schools, whereas in MTO, it doesn't look like they actually did a whole lot of changing of schools and school districts and so on. But on because Ethel Lawrence Homes is the only affordable low-income housing built, number one, there is more racial and economic integration. So you're right about that. Even though the income growth is dramatically greater for them than the controls, it's still kind of a black box. That is, the book doesn't really tell you how they got their jobs and what the networks were, and that really begs for more kind of the qualitative work that. But I don't know. I don't know that.
So the next questioner should get an introduction. This is Mark Schroeder, who has actually worked on MTO longer than probably anybody actually up on this table. Maybe Mike has been worked on a little bit longer, but Mark worked on it from its very beginnings, actually, when it was initially being discussed when the Bush administration, Bush 1, was here.
And that's what I wanted to start with. Mike, welcome back to HUD. This tragic oversight at Harvard. Yeah,
it
good.
wasn't in the economics department.
You actually never had the opportunity to have the general community of very low poverty families who didn't live in public housing in the demonstration. The law required you to have them for a control for that population, and why that would have been is an interesting question, because the proposal that the Bush administration sent over just said people living in high poverty. It didn't say anything about public housing, and the stuff about public housing was added in negotiations, and I'll tell you how to find out about this, between two people, and neither one of them remembers who was responsible. But this was, since it happened in '92, you can I mean, it was a different environment in '92 than it is today, and it probably wouldn't be added if you were doing this demonstration today, but on the other hand, you might not do this demonstration today. The other thing I wanted to say is that we're going to have a cityscape symposium coming out next month with a number of major articles, including a couple that Larry's co-author on, and I'm even a co-author on one of them, and you can find out everything you could possibly want to know about the history of MTO and why you would not necessarily want to compare the results of MTO with so-called quasi-experiments like Gautreaux. So, thanks for coming.
Just one point on the Mount Laurel. Because the families were coming not from public housing, you do have income effects of moving into assisted housing, whereas going from public housing with a voucher, there really aren't income effects. And whether that makes a difference, I don't know, but I thought I'd mention it.
So we are out of time for our panel. Please join me in giving a round of applause for our panel, and then Jean's going to give some closing remarks.
Well, I wanted to thank the distinguished panel for a very rich and informative discussion, and also thank you, Todd, for your leadership on this and your presentation. I also wanted to thank Kevin Kane for his quarterly briefing, and of course the staff and research utilization for helping organize this briefing. Our next quarterly will be in September, so please join us again, and have a great day. I'm sorry we had to cut this a little short. Thank you very much.